Good morning and welcome to the January 25th meeting of the Land Use and Environment Committee. Could I have a motion to approve our agenda?
I would move to approve the agenda.
I'll second that. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. I'm going to pause for just 1 second. I'm hearing from Councilmember Vasquez. She's saying it wasn't on her calendar, so let me just let her know she should have a link and email.
Yeah, these new committee assignments take a little everyone getting used to. So
Yeah, glad I texted her. Well, I think we can go ahead with this next item with 2 of 3 members present. So the next item is to elect a chair for the coming year for this committee.
and I would nominate you, Carolyn, to be chair of the committee.
Alrighty, thank you. I would accept the nomination. Are there any other nominations? Hearing none. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Obviously none opposed, so I will be your chair. Scott, were you voting or getting our attention?
Oh, yes, not voting. Councilmember Vasquez cannot make today's meeting, so I just want to let the committee know.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. I was kind of getting that impression. But anyway, all right, well, let's move on and we'll have presentation from Ryan Andrews about parking amendments. Ryan?
Yeah, good morning. Give me a second here to be able to share my screen. Okay, so we have a pending recommendation from the Planning Commission on some amendments to our parking standards. 2 separate amendments. The first one that I'm going to talk about today is amending some standards related to multifamily development, parking for multifamily development. The second is some requirements for electric vehicle parking. Both have gone through the Planning Commission process and are ready to go forward to the full City Council for a decision. That we briefed the Land Use Committee on this a couple months ago and wanted to kind of touch bases one more time with any last minute kind of things and opportunity for the committee to be able to ask questions before it goes to the full council. So as I mentioned, the first recommendation from the Planning Commission is to amend some parking standards for multifamily residential. So this would amend our Lease Municipal Code 16.72, which contains all of the parking standards for off-street parking, whether it's commercial standards, residential, you name it, it's all contained in there. But really, we're just focused on multifamily here today and with these amendments. So our current base parking ratio for multifamily development is 1.5 spaces per unit. It's not based on any type of unit type, or when I say unit type, I mean like number of bedrooms. It's a flat 1.5 spaces. If that's a studio apartment or if that's a 3-bedroom apartment, that's a 1.5 spaces per unit. And frankly, the standard has served the city well for the last probably 25 to 30 years that this has been in place. But really, with our changes to the multifamily development that has occurred in the last 5 years, particularly the proliferation or the development of more studio units and 1-bedroom apartments, this ratio hasn't quite kept pace with the needs of basing parking more on the unit type rather than a flat rate. The Planning Commission looked at this and their recommendation is shown on the screen here. 1 space per unit for a studio, 1.5 spaces for 1 and 2 bedroom units, and 2 spaces for 3+ bedroom units. I don't think we have any 4-bedroom apartments, but if we did, it would be 2 spaces. The Plan Commission in developing these standards looked at other jurisdictions, particularly some of our other local jurisdictions close by. These are consistent with regulations that currently apply in Tumwater. Olympia, interestingly enough, still goes with the 1.5 spaces per unit requirement. Planning Commission also looked at kind of more nationally how parking standards are developed, and really parking is an inaccurate science. There is no hard and fast rules that say, especially when it comes to multifamily development, that there should be any magic number associated with the space per unit count. It's based on local circumstances, on the infrastructure that's in place in the area, the amount of off-street parking that's available to people, the amount of transit. All those things go into establishing a parking ratio, and all those things can be fairly inaccurate, and they should be flexible over time. So that's what we're doing right now, is looking at increasing the flexibility associated with this, especially looking at it on a per unit basis. The regulations also provide some more flexibility, especially when we look at location-based parking reductions. And so there are specific recommendations in these draft regulations that would allow for multifamily developers to reduce their parking loads if they're within a half mile of 30-minute transit service. That's really important because I mentioned, we need to be flexible when it comes to these things. And one of the things that can reduce that parking load is the proximity to transit. So we need to be cognizant of that. Also, projects that provide vehicle share programs. This isn't just like ride sharing, like, catching a ride with a neighbor or something like this. This is those types of programs where an apartment complex might have a complex vehicle for people to use, to check out and use, so that they're not needing their own private vehicle as much. And this is something that we're currently seeing. I believe it's the 6th Avenue apartments that are currently under construction in the Midtown area that will roll this type of a program out. And so, that's a perfect example of a project, a lot of studio and 1-bedrooms. It's going to really be tailored towards college students. People aren't going to need to have a vehicle as much. And so we want to recognize that there are some flexibility needs when it comes to especially reducing the amount of parking that's required. And when I'm talking about the space per unit, 1.5 spaces per 1 and 2 bedrooms, that's really a minimum standard. We do not have, and we're not proposing any maximum standard. So a developer could always propose more. We're just looking at what the minimum should be. So why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this? First of all, we want to make sure that parking is right sized, that we're not requiring too much and that we're not requiring too little. Parking is expensive, and it could inadvertently raise the cost of development, which is ultimately passed on through to people's rents if too much parking is provided. So this is, we reached out to several local architecture firms. This is the information that they provided us back, is that for every surface parking stall, that costs about $6,000 per stall to install. If it's a structured parking stall, something that's elevated above the ground, that's $20,000 to $25,000 per stall. If it's underground, that's even more expensive at $30,000 to $50,000 per stall. Plan Commission looked at the proposed amendments and actually applied the new standard to 2 existing projects. It did result in the slight increase in parking to both. So this would, by approving this amendment, would generally increase the amount of parking that's required. This was added last year to the Planning Commission's work program as a result of some complaints that the city council received on an apartment complex on Britton Parkway. That was a complex that had provided the minimum parking on site. but they were renting to more individuals than they had been previously. And so people started using Britton Parkway as overflow parking, which Britton Parkway was never designed to have any on-street parking. It's a arterial street, which we don't allow on-street parking for. So the council did hear these concerns, loud and clear. And one of the things that this will do is hopefully allow for a little bit more off-street parking within these developments to get rid of some of the, the crunches in terms of parking that's required on site. Again, we're only looking at minimum parking. We're not looking at maximum. So if a developer wanted to provide more, they always could. It's important also to note that these regulations will only apply to future projects. So, I think it's been mentioned that we have about 1,600 units of multifamily in the pipeline. And if those developments already have a complete land use application in, they would be vested under the current 1.5 stalls per unit requirement. So again, these regulations would only apply to future projects after the regulations themselves were passed. The Planning Commission did outreach on this topic as well and met directly with that multifamily operator to discuss challenges. So the Planning Commission did discuss the challenges of that Britton Parkway apartment complex directly with the operator there. Before I move on to electric vehicle parking, I will mention as well that we did reach out to several local developers of multifamily. So we've got the operator perspective. We also got the developer perspective from several developers that are doing multifamily in our local area, and they all supported going to this methodology rather than our current 1.5 spaces per unit. So with that, I'll stop. I can move on to electric vehicle. Yeah, I'll stop sharing and ask any questions you might have on multifamily at this point.
Lenny?
Yeah, so Ryan, I'm just curious, you said that the developers were supportive. So they didn't have a concern with this driving up the cost of the apartments at all, the rental prices?
No concerns as far as that goes. They felt that it more closely aligned the unit type with the amount of parking that's needed. So, in looking at like the Britton apartments, we looked at what this standard would require versus what our old standard is. It's really like 5 spaces additional that it would have required. So, that's $30,000 to a multi-million-dollar project is not a significant development cost increase.
Yeah, and I just wanted to be sure on that because that's my only concern is, obviously we're in a housing crisis. So to do anything that would drive up rental prices would concern me greatly. But if they don't see it as an issue there, then it makes sense. I mean, obviously we can't have people parking on Britton Parkway. It just didn't work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions before I move on?
Okay.
All right, back to sharing my screen here. All right, so the next amendment is an amendment to Lease Municipal Code 16.73 related to electric vehicle parking. So first of all, the council is aware, obviously, that you've adopted now the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. The Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan shows that transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, that we can have the biggest difference influencing what, where, and how much people drive. So, Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan sets out the highest levels of greenhouse gas emissions that we can address. And number one on that list is transportation. So looking at this, we also are well aware that electric vehicles themselves, the EV registrations are increasing exponentially. Washington is the number 3 largest in the country as far as the number of electric vehicles on our roads. We also have standards that are being pushed by auto companies towards offering more electric vehicles to consumers. I think everybody's aware that EVs are the auto industry is becoming much more EV focused, with statistics that show by certain dates auto companies are going to be selling more electric vehicles than they will be gas powered vehicles themselves. So we're talking today about some amendments to our electric vehicle parking standards. We already currently have requirements for electric vehicle parking, but they're optional. So we do have some EV stations around town, but they've all used our optional regulations and have not been required through anything that's been done through our zoning code. So for example, there's a large EV charging station, Tesla charging station at Target. That was provided optionally by Target to accommodate that within their parking lot. That's not something that was ever required by the city. The parking that we have at City Hall was provided by the city to the people that and employees that want to use that, but it was not from any type of requirement. It was all optional. What this would do is it would turn some of those things that are currently optional into requirements. Before I talk about what those requirements would be, I did want to show here on the screen the number of EV vehicles registered in our state and what that looks like over time. So you can see in the last essentially 4 or 5 years, we've tripled the number of EVs on our roadways, and it's just going to keep increasing exponentially over time. So again, like I mentioned, this is something that will be coming soon, and something that we're seeing more and more of people installing these as we go along. So what does that mean in terms of what our regulations would be? So this first would amend Lease Municipal Code 16.73 to require electric vehicle parking for certain uses. So the focus here is really on those long-term uses. So things like multifamily residential with 10 or more units, 10% of the parking spaces would require to be EV. The lodging category, hotels, those kinds of things, again, another 10% of their stalls would be electric vehicle required. Office, institutional, municipal, medical, so that would be things like City Hall, the library, state office buildings, medical, so medical clinics and office buildings, those kinds of things would be at 3%. Industrial would be our light industrial users. So that would be primarily for employees out in the Northeast Lacey area, 1%. And then recreational, entertainment, cultural, things like movie theaters and those kinds of things. The Lacey Community Center might be considered recreational. Parks, all at 1%. It's important to note that this requirement wouldn't be retroactive, so it would not apply to anything that's existing now. It would only apply to new buildings or large parking expansions of more than 50% of the number of existing spaces. So if you had, first of all, I think a new building is fairly easy for people to understand. If you're doing a new development, this would be the requirement. If you had a parking lot expansion, if you had a parking lot of 100 spaces, for example, if you did an expansion of more than 50%, so 51 stalls or larger to that 100 stall parking field, you would be required to put in EV at that time. So what would the requirements actually look like in terms of the things that would be installed on the site? First, for every EV charging parking stall, you'd have to install a type 2 240 volt charger. So this is a mid-level charger. That type 1 is basically a 110 or 120, like typical residential household outlet. That would not be the minimum would be the type 2, which is the next level. Type 3 is the fast. I think that's 440 volt. That's typically like a Tesla supercharger. That's not what we're requiring either. The Planning Commission was really looking at, okay, how do we hit that mid-level? So 240 volt is going to be something that's going to take about 4 hours to charge a vehicle for. The charger cost for this is around $2,000 per charger to be installed. So that doesn't include the infrastructure to install that. Again, that's just the charger itself at $2,000. The infrastructure that would be required is an additional cost above and beyond that. We did do some additional edits to our design standards to allow for maximum flexibility. Some municipalities have been very specific when it comes to things like, the signage that's required, the location on the site for these types of stalls, those types of things. But really, when it came down to it, the Planning Commission looked at this and said, hey, nobody knows better than the property owner themselves or the developer that, where these should go and how they should be managed. And so we're really, even though we're requiring the stalls themselves, we're fairly hands-off in terms of, any type of signage, network that they have to be queued into, the payment requirements, whether somebody pays or not, left that all up to the developer or the manager of the site. The Planning Commission has recommended that this requirement not apply to commercial uses. So when I go back to this table here, one of the things you'll notice is that we're missing any type of commercial use. So things like grocery stores or big box retail, those types of uses, they're not here. And really, the Planning Commission looked at this and said, we believe that these requirements should apply for long-term parking only, not for, transient type of uses where people are going to come, go to a restaurant for an hour and go home, or go to the grocery store for 45 minutes and come home. Those types of commercial uses, those are not required to put in these types of stalls because they're not those long-term uses. So the Planning Commission really focused on the multifamily, the lodging, and those longer-term office type uses here. I think this little last thing I'll mention before I turn it over to you to questions is that, and it's very important to note, is that building and electrical codes currently within the International Building Code require that the infrastructure be installed, including space in electrical rooms and panels, to accommodate electric vehicle stalls. So this is something that was put in place by the State Building Code Council back in the summer of 2020. It requires that conduit and raceway within the parking area for all commercial, lodging, and multifamily uses be installed. So those are already requirements. And so what these requirements that the city would put in place would essentially say, okay, you need to go to the next level and put in the charger station. There is nothing in the state code currently that requires those charging stations to be installed, but they do have to do all the underground work, all of the raceway, all of the panel space in the building, and those kinds of things. And so really this is, just kind of taking it to the next step, which is actually requiring the charger in certain uses. And again, not for commercial. The IBC does require it for commercial, but we would not require it to be installed for those commercial type of uses. Oh, I do have another slide. We did also on this public outreach, we did information on our website. We actually notified all of our Lease business license holders. We wanted to get input from commercial uses on this and really focused on that. We did notify all of our business license folks on the proposal, even though a lot of them, they're commercial, this wouldn't apply. We did want to make sure that they were generally aware of the regulations as they were being considered. We did reach out also to our Lacey and Thurston County Chambers of Commerce and Facebook typical, outreach as well. We did not receive any formal comments through this process. And the Planning Commission unanimously recommended this, as well as the multifamily amendments to the City Council for consideration. So the next step for both of these items would be formal consideration of the Planning Commission's recommendation in ordinance form at your regular meeting. And I believe I've scheduled that at this point for the second meeting in February. So that would be February 17th. So with that, happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Lenny?
I have a couple of questions and comments, both. First, I'm not sure so the Planning Commission is not recommending that we require this for commercial, yet what I'm seeing is commercial is where they're being added regularly. I mean, the Safeway on Yelm Highway, the QFC, they're all adding these stations without any ordinance forcing them to. So I guess that's the comment part, but that leads to the question, which is, why do we need to require it if the market is doing this on its own, which it clearly to me is doing it? If you're building lodging, multifamily, whatever it is, and you know that residents were moving in the direction of more electric vehicles, you're going to put that in because you have to attract the people you want to attract. So I'm just not sure why we need an ordinance to do this when the market is already doing it.
And that's a perfectly logical comment, and not something that I necessarily have a direct answer for. That's definitely a philosophical argument against one way or the other. I think the main thing is that we wanted to take a look at this because it is a recommendation coming out of the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan for all of the Thurston County jurisdictions to adopt regulations for EV parking. So if the council feels like, hey, the market's taking care of that, we don't need to worry about it, then the council doesn't need to amend the regulations. If you feel like, we feel like this is a priority coming out of the TCMP, then you have the option and the Plan Commission's recommendation.
Would it be two separate actions, the two different topics? So the multifamily parking and then the electrical parking, are they going to be two separate issues that we vote on as council?
Typically not, because it's part of one recommendation. This would come forward as part of one ordinance, but the council could always remove any of the amendments to Lacey Municipal Code 16.73 out of that ordinance at the meeting itself. So you could you could do that. The council has the option as well to split the ordinances up into two if you're more comfortable going that direction.
I would make a motion even to forward this to the council for consideration, but as two separate ordinances.
Can we pause this for a minute? Robin has to leave early and it looked like she had a comment.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I apologies. I do need to step away. I have a meeting right now for something else. But I wanted to, I guess, respond that I think it's wonderful that a lot of businesses are taking it upon themselves to recognize a need within the market and add these. But I still think that implementing this as a policy for the city creates a floor, right? So that people who are going to be buying electric vehicles in the future have a reasonable expectation they're going to be able to access a charging station. And it doesn't hurt the businesses that are already doing it on their own, but it provides that sort of expectation, that foundational, like, I'm going to have a place to charge, and that some businesses won't skirt the additional cost because there's no code enforcement. That's my perspective on it. I think it doesn't hurt if businesses are already doing it, but it does provide that a little bit more insurance that people are going to have access to charging stations.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Councilmember Vasquez was on the Plan Commission when this went through, and really, that's why Plan Commission recognized that commercial uses were essentially doing this on their own and really focusing on those longer term parking stalls. People, parking for employees, parking for residents, parking for people that are going to be spending time at a medical clinic. Those typically aren't being installed on a regular basis right now, and so where we're seeing it is more commercial uses, which, if you owned an electric vehicle and you didn't have access at your multifamily complex, chances are you're not going to be renting there. And if you did find places, you'd be going around town and charging wherever you were going to go. So more of those commercial locations, which again, those are highly transitory, short-term uses. And so really the Plan Commission wanted to look at those long-term uses and how do we encourage that.
Scott?
Hey, Ryan, just a couple of clarifications. So you mentioned that the building code now requires conduit runs throughout the parking lots.
Right.
Is that 100% covers every stall in there?
No, I think it covers 5%, if I remember right, of the stalls. So the state code has, you basically have to put in the raceway, the conduit, the panel space, those kinds of things to accommodate EV parking for 5% of the stalls in the new parking area.
And when did that law go into effect? Was that last year or 2 years ago?
It was summer of 2020.
Okay. So some of the new construction potentially at Britton Parkway may have that or may not.
Yeah, so I'm not, yeah, it depends on the, the timing. I reached out to Wade Duffy, our building official, on this to kind of get his take on it and to see how we're applying it. And so, for example, the 6th Avenue apartments MGR is doing will have will be EV charging ready because it's a new project. So no word on whether or not those will be installed at this point, but they will be at least EV ready.
And then just last question, was there any discussion with planning commission on that issue of just making sure the conduit was available? Because 10 years from now or 15, to make those marketable sites, I mean, they're gonna have to rip up parking lots and then, have to basically make the runs and provide electricity.
Yeah, that's a good point. And at the time, we did have an architect on the planning commission. He's no longer on the planning commission, but he did provide some great feedback on that, specifically around how much you'd have to retrofit both a building and a parking lot to put in EV charging, and the cost associated with that. That's why the bar is fairly high when it comes to, number one, it has to either be a new building or it has to be 50% or more of an expansion of an existing parking lot for us to be able to require that. So you're already doing a significant, investment in terms of a capital project to do a new building, or, you're doing a large parking lot expansion, small parking lot expansions, building remodels, those types of things, those would not have to put in EV charging. So it's really those large projects where you'd either be installing new or doing a significant expansion of an existing parking lot is really where this would apply. Because it really would be very expensive to take this through an existing parking lot, retrofit those. So I don't want to say it only really makes financial sense for new development. There's some case to be made where you could retrofit parking to be able to accommodate these, but really it's mostly going to apply in new facilities because of that upfront cost.
Okay.
Lenny, did you have any further question?
Nope, I'm good.
You got yours? Okay. One thing I'm kind of curious about, whether there was some consideration given to, is incentivizing developers into going, beyond the minimum standards, or going ahead and because we know where the future is taking us with electric vehicles and all. I'm just wondering if there's anything that we can do to help make that transition smoother and more palatable.
There was nothing that was considered through the ordinance amendments. One of the things that we might think about on maybe a slightly different track would be, those type of financial incentives that we may be putting forth as far as the implementation of the TCMP. So, we're looking at energy audit and retrofit type programs. Potentially, this is something that somebody could qualify for, would be a, installation of an EV charging station or something like that. I think that's how, we might be able to incentivize things. I just don't know in parking if there's enough incentive to be able to do something without providing direct financial incentives to help pay for it. And that's something that really isn't in our zoning code. That would be something that would be outside of that realm and more of like a grant or something like that, where people might be able to put these in. Unless somebody else has a better idea than I do, that's kind of what I can think of. Certainly nothing that the Planning Commission talked about.
Okay. Would you like a motion from us to forward this on to council?
I don't need one. There's already been a recommendation made by the Planning Commission, so this will go to you regardless. It sounds like Councilmember Greenstein made a motion about whether or not to split this into 2 ordinances. Be happy to do that. It's up to you. I don't even think that really needs to necessarily be a motion. If the land use committee is comfortable in taking that as 2 ordinances, we could certainly work with the city attorney to be able to accomplish that.
That would be my preference, only because I think it's just easier than us looking at one and then trying to amend it at the council meeting. It's easier, I think, to look at them as 2 separate issues.
Okay.
Would that delay or add to the cost of moving this forward?
No, not at all.
Okay, well then I have no objections.
So do we have a formal motion to take each issue as a separate amendment? So two
Ryan said
separate
we didn't.
ordinances? Okay,
If you want to withdraw your motion, just to be clean.
Yeah, if we don't need one, I'll withdraw the motion. That's fine.
Okay.
okay.
So yeah, at this point, it's a recommendation from the planning commission. It'll come to you regardless, and we'd be happy to split that into two. It's not something that we typically do, but understand the concerns at this point. We can do that for sure.
You know. All righty. Anything else for good of the order? Nope. Okay. I just have one quick thing. The Climate Mitigation Steering Committee met yesterday, and we'll be receiving some documents that I'll share with the whole council. It's legislative updates on environmental bills and just a couple we may want to be thinking about as a council. So I'll pass those along as soon as I get them.
Thank you.
All righty. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. And if there's nothing else, we'll call this